Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to see what a nice turnout we had for this webinar, and I'm hoping it'll be very informative and useful for you. This is the latest in a series, I think maybe the third or the fourth of the webinars that we started last year around public policy, advocacy, and legislative conundrums, if you want to put it that way. Our policy advisor in Washington, Brian Lindberg, will be talking to you soon. We've been busy in recent months on our own in collaboration with a variety of organizations like the American Geriatric Society, Elder Care Workforce Alliance, HIPNIC, and others, and trying to move the legislative ball forward to ensure that the support for the programs that we're so committed to still continues. So I'm looking forward to hearing the update again today from Brian, and he and I and anyone else among the officers will take questions once he does that original introduction. Okay, Brian, all yours.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And can you hear me, Catherine? Okay, great. You could put up my slideshow if you wouldn't mind, Ted. Okay, there I am. Okay, let's go to the, we can skip that one. I am your public policy advisor and lobbyist in DC. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, what I plan to cover today. Good afternoon, and as Maura said, it's a great turnout. Thank you for joining this webinar, and I hope that you continue as we have additional webinars throughout the year, because things do keep changing here. Sometimes they seem the same, but they are changing, and the process moves forward. What I'd like to cover today briefly is kind of the big picture, what's going on in DC. The short version of the budget and appropriations process, we could do a whole webinar just on how it works. The GWEP reauthorization, and we'll do some Q&A, and if hopefully we'll also have a little conversation about what everyone is hearing and thinking about what we've heard from HRSA. And at the end, I'll try and answer any questions you have about all this. So let's go to the next slide, beyond GWEP, the big picture. And also, I guess I should say, beyond the FBI, which is pretty much what we hear about daily here in Washington. It's hard. Let me just say, it really is a distraction. What goes on in the White House, the tweets, the Russian investigation, the FBI is a distraction, not only to those of us, just trying to focus on aging and healthcare issues and our clients, but also the whole town is just, Congress spends time responding, and it's a very weird period. I've been here since 1983, and the last year has by far been the most strange to be a part of. So let's talk about the big picture. The biggest thing right now is, and I'll talk a lot about this, but the biggest thing right now is getting a top-level agreement on the budget and spending caps for fiscal year 2018, which we're in now, and started October 1, 2017, and fiscal year 2019. The leadership of the House and Senate are trying to come up with agreement on the amount they will spend for those two fiscal years. They want to do it. They want to do them both together. As you know, we had a shutdown recently of the government. It was really not much of a shutdown, as shutdowns go, because it took place over the weekend, and people kept delivering meals to the elderly, and offices didn't close down. If you wanted to go to a national park that day, it might have been a little different. You could have gotten into the park, but maybe not into you know, the historic buildings on the park. So it was really a very minor shutdown, and it was very political. And it was really a lot about what we call the Dreamers, the DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that is due to end in March. And everyone, I think, pretty much, the Democrats and the Republicans, want to resolve this so that these young people don't have to be deported. But that was the stake in the ground that the Democrats placed in order to push for an agreement that there would be a vote on the Dreamers set in the Senate. And they got agreement on that, and that's just about all they got, basically. Interestingly enough, the CHIP program, the Childhood Health Insurance Program, also got funded and authorized in the extension that they did for 6 years. So that was a really good thing the Democrats have been fighting for months. And that is why, of course, the Republicans put it in the package in order to get them on board. Also on the list of to-dos is the Senators Alexander and Murray have a bill, and Senators Collins and Nelson have a bill that would stabilize the insurance marketplace for Obamacare or ACA, and create risk pools as well. There's also an $81 billion disaster relief bill that's sitting here ready to do on this to-do list. There's something called health extenders, which these are programs that need to be extended that will run out. One is related to Medicare therapy caps. There's one that deals with subsidies for Part D, prescription drugs for low-income individuals. There's a program called Money Follows the Person that needs to be extended. That's all on the table. They've got sexual harassment rules for Congress. They've got the debt limit, which is running out, which has run out, but they're doing, they're manipulating dollars right now, and they think they can do that until March. And they've got a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. All of that is the big picture. And we're just, you know, a tiny piece of all of that, but of course we're very focused on it. But all of that is supposedly going to get done in an election year. And all of you know that it's extremely difficult to get big things done in an election year, particularly the closer it gets to the election. Unless Republicans and Democrats both feel they will be advantaged by getting a bill through, things just grind to a halt, often come around June or so. We'll see if that happens this year. And then finally, in the big picture, you know the tax cut bill became law. It created a $1.5 trillion additional deficit. And that deficit now has given the Republican Party an incentive, if you will, an excuse or whatever, to say we really need to rein in entitlement programs. And we knew this was going to happen. It was a two-part deal. Here, cut taxes, even though it creates a bigger deficit, and then we'll fix the deficit later by cutting social programs. And on the table right now are Medicaid, Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, the Social Services Block Grant Program, food stamps, or what they call SNAP, legal services, and a number of others. So that is all the big picture. And now I'm going to go to my next slide and zoom in on what we're going to focus on over the next number of months. Just a footnote, Medicare during an election year is probably pretty safe. Social Security is probably off the table. And this is the process that, this is the old adage about making sausage. I prefer my sausage grilled, so I show a picture of grilled sausage. But the bottom line is it can be an ugly process. Here's what we've got. We've got a budget that has to be dealt with. budget reconciliation, which is a subpart of the budget process, appropriations, and then we do it all again. We're right now about to overlap that process for fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019. So let's go to the next slide where there's a little more detail there. The president's going to put out his budget, they say, February 12th. It could be moved, but that's when they're talking about it. Congress basically will ignore his budget, although they once in a while they'll pick up little pieces if they agree with it anyway. But they do their own budget, and that budget really typically is used if the House and the Senate can pass a budget. That is used to create a legislative vehicle called budget reconciliation. And that's the vehicle they used year before last to repeal ACA, or they started that process, right at the beginning of this Congress. And they used the FY 2017 reconciliation bill to try to repeal ACA. They failed. With tax reform, they used a reconciliation package for FY 2018, the budget they passed for 2018, and they did get that through. It doesn't appear that this year they're going to have a big package. The reason they do those budget reconciliation packages is because in the Senate there are special rules that they only need 50 votes, a majority, basically a majority. If they have 50, then the vice president can break the tie. But you basically need a simple majority to get a budget reconciliation package through, and that's why they use that. Otherwise, they would go with the regular order, and in the Senate, you generally have to get about 60 people on board so that you can move the bill forward. Otherwise, they can just keep delaying the vote and such. So anyway, we've got a fiscal year 2018 budget, and that was all about tax reform and reconciliation. Now we'll have a fiscal year 2019 budget, and that will be a bit different because they're not going to spend all their time doing the tax reform or ACA repeal. So let's go to the appropriations, and that's where we get our money. So there was the political 3-day shutdown. Let's go to the next slide, please. We are now functioning on a continuing resolution, which is keeping government open through February 8th, 2018. So they right now are trying to figure out what to do as of February 18th. They are still functioning under the 2010 budget agreement and the caps and sequestration. So if they don't come to a resolution about the overall amount of money they will spend in 2018, there will be sequestration. And the same thing for 2019. The big issue there is that the Democrats are insisting on parity between any increases in defense spending and any increases in non-defense discretionary spending, so that we can't jack up defense and basically cut human services. That's the bottom line. So that's where we are there. Last year's budget, the president didn't do that well for older adults. You can see there I've mentioned some of the programs that he proposed to eliminate, including a number of HRSA programs and the GWEPs. The bottom line, the appropriators for FY 2018, which we're still functioning under that continuing resolution. The appropriators on the House side did some cutting, including they cut $4 million from the GWEP program. But the Senate has level funding, so we continue to advocate for at least the Senate level for FY 2018. And again, the final bill, the thing to remember is they've got to get 60 votes in the Senate in order to end the debate. If they have the 60 votes, they can move to consideration and get the bill passed, even if they pass it with fewer than 60 people. But if they don't have 60, they basically, it's like a filibuster. You're basically prolonging the discussion until they come to a bill that 60 people can support. So let's go to the next slide. Just a little bit on timing. So you've got February 8th coming up, and that's a potential shutdown day again. You know, if they by midnight on February 8th, if they don't come to agreement, even on a short-term agreement like they have now, the government could shut down again. If it shuts down again, a number of people that I've spoken to really worry that it'll be a longer period this time. It will be that they've just dug their heels in and no one's going to give. But it's also more likely that they'll have a couple more short-term continuing resolutions until they can agree on the final amount to spend for 2018 and 2019. Once they do that, then the appropriators still need a couple weeks just to write the very specifics of the bill that matches up with those overall new numbers that they have. The House and the Senate bills are very far apart right now in terms of spending. For example, they're about $5 billion apart just in the Subcommittee for Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies, which is the one that we watch most closely. So you can see we'll be in a continuing resolution till the 8th. We may have another one, and then the president's actually going to be submitting the next budget while we're still working on the old budget. As I mentioned, mid-March, the Treasury Department says they're going to run out of ways to keep paying our bills. So a debt limit extension, it basically just allows the government to borrow money to pay its current bills, not future bills, just current bills. That debt limit will probably be incorporated in one of the continuing resolutions so that there's not another stalemate on a bill like that. And then between March and May is where all the appropriations work takes place, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a couple minutes, for the FY 2019 budget. Now let me turn to reauthorizing the GWEP on the next slide. We have had great success this last year or so in working toward reauthorization of the GWEP. The program was never mentioned in previous authorization law because obviously HRSA merged all the geriatrics programs 3 years ago, creating the GWEP, and Congress did nothing to approve that except fund it through the appropriations process. It never changed the language about geriatric education centers or GACAs or anything in the current law. That law expired, and so we have been working with members of Congress to clearly define what the GWEP is. And Representative Jan Schakowsky from Illinois, from Chicago, the Evanston area, introduced a bill on our behalf that we worked with AGS and the Elder Care Workforce Alliance on. And that bill describes both the GWEPs and the GACAs and provides $51 million in authorization. As you may recall, we're now currently funded at $38.737 million, so that would be an increase. It would allow for a number of additional GWEP sites, and it would allow for GACAs to be provided across the country, not necessarily just at GWEPs. The bill was referred to the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Health Subcommittee, and that's chaired by Representative Burgess and from Texas. And he held a hearing on it. Our Texas GWEP testified at that hearing, and he has included in his bill, HR 3728, you see listed there, he's included all our language except the increases because of the Republican rules in the House. Unless he shows how he can pay for the increase, he can't increase the total amount he's spending on the programs he's reauthorizing in Title VII. They would like, I believe they actually, staff wants to increase the program, and we continue to chat with them about how we could get that done. But for now, we've got the Schakowsky bill with the money we want, we've got his bill with the language we want, and we hope that works out in the long run. The House has not voted on that. The Energy and Commerce Committee has not voted on that. That's where Burgess is. And we're hopeful that that happens this spring. On the Senate side, we've secured Senator Collins from Maine to introduce a bill that will be probably exactly like Representative Schakowsky's bill, describing the GWEPs, what we do, and funding us at the higher funding level. They are working with Legislative Counsel, that's the staff that writes bills. Now, to do that, they're hoping that Senator Casey from Pennsylvania will be the lead Democrat on that bill with them. They chair and co-chair the Senate Special Committee on Aging. Now, Senator Reid is doing a bigger bill like the Burgess bill that has other Title VII elements in it besides the GWEPs, but Senator Reid's staff has agreed to use our language, the Schakowsky language, in his bill as well. So we feel good about right now how the Senate will move forward. The Senate is even further behind, though, as you can see, because the Collins and Reid bills haven't been introduced. They're further behind. So Senate action could be, late spring, in the summer, or later. We just really don't know how quickly things will go. So let me move to the next slide, which is just a reminder that we need you to advocate. And let's go to the next slide. And let me say that before I mention some of the things we're going to be doing this year, I want to thank all of you who have written to your members of Congress, done some advocacy. Some of you have made visits to the Hill or to your congressional offices back in the state or district. A few of you have hosted site visits, which are really excellent. They're a great way to show off your program and get the commitment of the member of Congress and their staff. So we really appreciate all of that help, and it does make a difference. What we're going to do, and I won't go into great detail here, but this year what we're going to do, we will be submitting written testimony to the House Appropriations and the Senate Appropriations committees. We submitted to the subcommittee on labor HHS, as I mentioned before. In the House, they will actually have a number of hearings with outside witnesses as opposed to government witnesses. And we will request a chance to actually present the testimony there. It's a long shot. They give very few opportunities out, but we'll ask. But if they don't invite us, we will submit our written testimony. It will reflect all of the things we've been talking about. It will be a modified version of last year's testimony because, frankly, things have been pretty stagnant with all the continuing resolutions and no new money. So it will reflect what you've seen on the website from last year. We'll also, as we do every year, start the process of educating OMB about our programs, the Office of Management and Budget, for next year, because they are already, after the president puts out his budget for this year, they will start the budget proposals for the next year. So we'll be doing that. We'll probably do that with one or more of our advocacy groups, our coalitions that we're a part of. Coalition support, I go to the Leadership Council of Aging Organization meetings and the HIPNIC meetings and the Elder Care Workforce Alliance meetings and the Friends of HRSA meetings, and we will ensure that they all have budget numbers that reflect what we want. Now, HIPNIC and the Friends of HRSA have they put big HRSA numbers in, so as long as it is a large enough number to include our increases, we support those letters. With the Elder Care Workforce Alliance and the Leadership Council of Aging Organizations, we actually work to get our precise number in. The 51 million that we'll be requesting again this year, they will be included in their letters as they were last year if we do our homework and do the advocacy that I do here properly. And finally, the grassroots, and that's what you guys have been doing, and you'll be getting advocacy alerts from us over the next several months. Sometimes you'll get a specific request from one of us asking you if you'll make a call or sign on to testimony or something. And then more broadly, we'll be asking all the participants of NAGE to communicate with their members of Congress requesting for our funding levels. And you'll see something in the next several weeks about that. Maura, would you like to say something about HRSA, and then we can move into Q&A?
Sure. I think probably everybody on the call has heard by now, but there's been a decision at HRSA that they are planning to entertain applications which sound like they'll be relatively straightforward for one-year extensions if and when they secure the appropriations from Congress. And those would need to be obviously appropriations that include support for our program. As Brian was indicating just a few minutes ago, I think, I'm not the most sophisticated political observer, that it looks relatively clear that we've got pretty strong bipartisan support in both houses for continuing the programs at least level funding for this year and potentially increasing next year with the new reauthorization language. The bigger challenge, as Brian is alluding to, is whether the two parties in both houses can get together enough to come to a broad overall agreement that will allow that to happen. The challenge for us and for HRSA, I think, as well, is that the timing is becoming tight. So if in fact we wind up with one or more continuing resolutions before coming to consensus, which we can ask Brian, looks pretty likely, I would think, at this point, then in the setting of just having basically continued appropriations for a couple of weeks at a time, they can't offer us an opportunity for programs in good standing that are doing patient level and system level work to proceed with that additional year of funding. So I'm sure everybody on the call is thinking about the dates that the current grant funding is due to expire, reflecting back on Brian's words about how things tend to slow down in the coming months, and are trying to do their own calculations about what the probabilities are that this can actually occur in time to avoid a gap in funding. And that, I think, is the million-dollar question. And we are liable, in fact, certain, to be coming back to you to ask for increased support in terms of advocacy with the political process to try to move things forward as promptly as possible once those sort of initial broader agreements are reached, assuming that can happen. So I think it probably makes sense for Brian to, and there may be others on the call with enough experience as well to offer their best guess at the current moment about the soonest we would be likely to see such an agreement, and obviously the latest we could see such agreement would be we wouldn't, and it would lap into the next year. But that I think is probably really where the rubber meets the road. We know that HRSA is making a heroic effort to avoid a gap in funding. They will move as quickly as they possibly can once that initial authorization comes through. And one of the reasons I think that they're approaching things this way is to try to support us so that we'll have an additional year to secure the outcomes data, which also will make the programs more politically sustainable in the years to come.
Why don't we open it up for questions and comments?
So to ask a question, you can hover over the Zoom screen and unmute yourself in the lower left. You can also type in the chat box if you click the chat in the lower center of your Zoom screen.
While we're waiting for people to figure out the technology, Brian, what would be your estimate about the earliest realistic point at which we might see sort of decision around an omnibus? Personally, I can't begin to conceive that it could happen during this current continuing resolution.
Right. It's just extremely unlikely that. I mean, if they could come up with the funding caps, how much they're going to spend on defense and non-defense discretionary spending, if they could come up with that before February 8th, I think that would be a bit of a miracle. But if they could, then they could easily, then they would have an agreement pretty quickly, I think, on a short-term CR. They would move forward with the Dreamers legislation in the Senate, which would get that monkey off the Senate's back at least. And then people say that they would need at least 3 weeks before they could get what they would call an omnibus appropriations bill. They would put all 12 appropriations bills together and fund all the programs for the rest of fiscal year 2018. So, I mean, you can see we're already, when we're talking like that, we're already at the end of February. And I think that's extremely optimistic. I mean, on a daily basis, I mean, just last week, a number of key Republicans said, oh, I think we're going to have several short-term continuing resolutions. That's very worrisome to me, because that means they're already predicting that the stalemate is not moving fast enough.
Typically, the CRs are usually something on the order of 3 weeks. Am I remembering that right, Brian?
Well, it really does vary, yeah. But that would be a reason. If the next CR, if they think they've got an agreement, or if they do on the total spending, it would really be based on what the Appropriations Committee staff said they needed to get the bill ready to bring to the floor. It might have a little to do with how quickly they could get the Dreamers bill done too, but I think there'll be plenty of time for that in the Senate if they come up with the caps.
This is Maura from University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you so much for all the information. I had a question about the process for the possible one-year continuing funding that you mentioned. Is there going to be, invitation for proposals, or is that going to be based on the review by the HRSA staff and determination?
The detail, this is Maura. The details haven't really been released yet, which is why you're asking a very appropriate question. But what I understand is that the instructions about requesting the extension would come out and be incorporated into the end of this year's report. I believe that the sort of key criteria are obviously going to be, you know, program in good standing, but also people will want to be able to very clearly demonstrate what system and patient level outcomes are being tracked. And I think virtually all of us are doing that to a greater or lesser extent, but highlighting that as strongly as you can should help to secure the extension.
Thank you. And a related question then, should we be like sure that at this year there will not be a new call for a 3 or whatever period grant funding?
That much is clear. HRSA did make that announcement. There will not be what they call a NOFO this year.
Got it. Thank you.
Anticipating doing it next year, and I believe made that decision for primarily 2 reasons. One, I think there was widespread agreement and understanding that the kind of complex programming that we're doing and the ramp at the beginning are such that I think they knew from the start that it was going to be a major challenge to really demonstrate the outcomes and get the traction and momentum over 3 years. So there's that. And then frankly, I think the very practical piece is that these folks are infinitely more experienced than I am with the logistics and timing and vagaries of the governmental process and funding. And they can do the math in terms of how many weeks it's going to take to do what better than we can. And I believe, although nobody has explicitly stated it to me, that it was clear to them that they were not going to be able to get a NOFO out in time to get it back and scored in time to not, that they would be unable to do that without a significant gap in funding. And they're worried about the people that we've hired and the programs that we've developed, and do not want to see a situation where, whatever it is, there's a however many month gap. We have to let people go that we hired, programs kind of tank, and then in 6 or 8 months, or maybe even shorter, you're trying to ramp up and start all over again from scratch. So I think it was a combination of kind of seeing the writing on the wall in terms of the timing and the logistics, and also realizing that most programs probably could really benefit from a longer runway.
Thank you very much for the clarification.
And we had a question in the chat box from Laura Gerard. She asked, are other programs under DHHS and HRSA going to have a similar 1-year extension? Sorry if that's covered her microphone. Her speakerphone's fuzzy.
I actually don't know. I haven't explicitly spoken with any of the folks at HRSA about that. I've been so focused on trying to move the ball forward and understand what was going on in terms of our own programming. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is just an observation, but there are, there have been NOFOs released for other
That's true.
programs and grant opportunities. So I would say this probably isn't a blanket occurrence. It might be something GWEP specific that takes into account those programming needs that the GWEPs have.
I suspect you're right. I just don't know the details around the other programs.
And those programs may have different funding calendars than we do. We can check. Any questions about the reauthorization or the appropriations process?
I have one, Brian. I think I know the answer, but what the heck, I've been wrong so many times, I'll just ask. Assuming that the reauthorization language that we've got now in bills goes through, I would imagine that that would be likely to significantly impact the numbers that actually showed up in appropriations, at least for 19, or is that overly simplistic and naive of me to think that if the appropriations language would be more likely to reflect the higher numbers in the reauth?
Well, a couple things. I think it is a positive way to look at it. It's the reason we're pushing for those higher numbers. Obviously, we haven't been able in some of these tough appropriations years to get the appropriators to give us the amount we want. So it would certainly help if we had the program authorized, first of all. Appropriators look down on programs that haven't been authorized. So get it authorized, clearly stating what we do, get the higher numbers, and then work within the system to try to get increased appropriations. Now, we have a senator in Susan Collins who is not only willing to introduce a bill that would increase our funding level, but she's also on the Appropriations Committee. So we're hopeful that if enough of these pieces fit together, we'll have a better chance. And even though she doesn't have a GWEP in Maine, she's spoken very highly of the GWEPs, and she's the good folks at Dartmouth put together materials for me around what they do for the region, including specifically Maine activities, which we've shared with her. And so, you know, she may fight harder than we've had others fighting for us in the future. So we need the bigger numbers. It's harder for appropriators to go over the authorized number. So that's a first step, and I think it's fair to be optimistic that we've got some people who care about the program. Every year, they say, you know, the folks up on the Hill, the staff, the appropriators say, oh, it's a really tough year. Funding increases are going to be nearly impossible. Yet every one of the years where I've heard them saying that, there were programs that did get increases. And our goal is to put together the right coalition of members in the House and the Senate who support us, who understand the work we do, to be one of those programs that gets one of the small increases that do happen even in tough budget years.
Yes.
Okay, this is Rich Schultz from the University of Pittsburgh. So I have a timing question that Maura or Brian might be able to give us some insight on. So at what point does the bridge year disappear? Meaning, if things are not resolved by X point in time, it essentially means that this bridge year is gone in terms of funding support.
I think that we're essentially bound by the federal fiscal year. So if we get to, you know, September, and it's all continuing resolutions, and then you're negotiating appropriations for 19 because 18 is gone, my guess is that's the point at which it disappears. Is that what you would understand as well, Brian?
Well, right now, when does your funding expire? Is it sometime in the summer?
Yeah, June, the end of June.
End of June. So you actually have cash on hand, if you will, through June. Is that how they do it, or?
It's a complex process. You sort of run the costs, pay the people, and then sort of submit for reimbursement into the kitty from the government, and the money continues to flow through the end of the grant period within the limits of, you know, whatever cap it was that you were awarded. Now, if folks have sort of unused funds that they would apply to carry forward, that they might be able to do that and hold for a few more months. I think it's extremely unlikely that anybody's got enough in the kitty that they could get through a full gap year.
Right, yeah.
So,
And how that would be handled is also going to depend on whether there's another sort of transitional continuation year, or it stops dead in its tracks. If it stops dead in its tracks, then the process, as I understand it, is a what they call an application for a no-cost extension. If in fact an additional year is forthcoming, then it would be the same process that we've all used before with the, you know, request for carryover funds.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because your program dates, if you will, June to June, you know, aren't aligned with the fiscal year. So, my guess is that if they did an extension year, people got their proposals in and gave everybody a 1-year extension, it would be a 1-year extension through June 20. Let's see, we're in 2018, so it would be an extension through June 2019, and you find yourself again in that same situation where we'd be in the middle of a fiscal year when they would be, you know, sending out the notice of funding. So I just, I'm not sure. I guess what I need to figure out is, I mean, the real dilemma would be, let's just say there was a reduction in funding for fiscal year 2018. How would that affect the number of GWEPs that could be funded for this extension? If it was $4 million less, you know, based on the House number versus the Senate number, which is level funding. So I just think that the other issue, of course, being trying to be optimistic, is that if they authorize the program as we've written it, that when they do put out the NOFO next year, it would include a request for applicants for GACAs as well. So, you know, and they would, in theory, they would do that if Congress provided the additional money. So it gets complicated. I don't know how much of your next calendar year, you know, say July on, that includes this extension. I don't know how much of that is covered in this this current FY 2018 appropriations. That's what the overlap is. What I should just talk to somebody at HRSA about that. When they get the appropriations for $38.737 million, and if the program, say, let's say they got that FY 2018 money for the 38 million, and the program just ended as of June, would they still have money for just through September, or would that actually, or is that 38 going to cover them into next June? So that's, if anyone knows that, I'd be very interested. But we can just ask HRSA that. But you know, they will do their best. They think Congress is going to keep funding this. They will do their best to keep it going without interruption. They don't, you know, they have certain limitations, but I think another conversation or two over the next week or two might clarify at least the timing for that 1 year NOFO.
That they can't clarify the timing because they can't do it until and unless they get the appropriations. So
Yeah.
if something changes in Congress, then they can sort of provide us an estimate of what the time frame is going to be. But as long as kind of the political lay of the land is so uncertain, I don't think there's a thing in the world they're going to be able to tell us about timing because they don't know either.
Yeah, my impression is that FY 2018 funds, if they went ahead and finished that appropriation process, actually will cover all the way until June, and that gives them the time to put out early next year the NOFO. And again, they'll put it out, right, and we'll be in the same darn position probably. It might be a little better if they can come up with the 2-year cap limits, but they easily could be functioning under a continuing resolution again next fall and early next year when they're trying to do this bigger NOFO. But I think they'll know more, particularly if we get the authorization done.
Right. And I just want to point out that there's some conversation happening in the chat box around the no cost extension. And that usually that can last for up to 6 months. And then some discussion around whether or not there's a lag. Usually not, according to Stacy Barnes, who's experienced with this. And that we should have those funds and that you just request to continue using those into the.
And I explicitly asked that question for within the last week or two of one of the HRSA officers and was told by the finance person, I think I'm remembering it right, that they believed that they could process and approve that in roughly a month. Of course, if we're all doing it, it might take them longer.
Right, and yeah, and the with the end of the GEC grants, and Stacy's saying this, and feel free to unmute, Stacy, that you apply usually in May, and that they get those done by June, so you don't end up having a lag when you do the
Correct.
extension.
That's essentially what they told me as well.
So we're coming to the end of the hour, and we should be conscious of people's time. I want to make one point. I want to thank Brian for his work. Brian has worked a lot for the GWEPs. NAGE is the only group that's really solely dedicated to advocating for GWEPs and similar geriatric education funding. And so we thank you for your membership. We have to have your membership in order to do this advocacy. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for paying your dues and being part of the group. We really believe in what we're doing and think that it's important, and hopefully seeing what Brian's been able to do shows that. We made the decision to increase the contract with Brian because we're at such a crucial point in the funding of the GWEPs, and his work has really is paying off because
Brian's worth every nickel, double and triple.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Any closing
Thank you.
comments or last questions?
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thank you all.
Very good. And if any of you have sort of specific topics or requests that you would want to make sure that we focus on in future webinars, please just let us know.
We'll be in
Thank
touch.
you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.